in America and the rest of the world at the moment, but I'm glad to be at least virtually in Texas tonight. So let me share you my thoughts on the topic of nationalism in Europe in the times of COVID. And of course, a lot of it is not just about Europe, but could be taken more broadly. But this is the area I mostly work on. I work mostly on Southeastern Europe. I assume you can see my screen, right? So that's okay, right? I've shared it, so you should be able to see it. So what I want to look at is exactly as Barbara's outlined, is there seems to be kind of two countervailing trends or directions one can think about this topic. One is, well, isn't COVID-19 a pandemic, which is a global phenomena, which does not discriminate, it affects all human beings, the great equalizer, the one which makes no distinction, and so we're all in the same boat, and we should all, in a certain way, not care about national belonging and national boundaries. And you could also argue that people who never experienced being trapped in their own country, who are from wealthy countries who could travel around the world whenever they wanted to, all of a sudden are trapped, cannot leave their country. Americans can't leave so easily. Most Europeans can't leave their country so easily. We're all experiencing that, what many people are experiencing normally for most of the world. So, like that seems like it might be the great equalizer, or even as Barbara has been saying, migration is not on the top of the agenda. We have other concerns in Europe and in North America. But, basically the question I'm really trying to answer is, well, what is the effect of the pandemic in Europe on nationalism? And I want to look at four elements where I think it reinforces different types of nationalism. One is what I call like the medical nationalism, the kind of closing of borders. The second one is the interrelationship with xenophobia and the pandemic. The third is authoritarian populism and the pandemic, and then the politics of fear and conspiracy. And I'll wrap up by looking at those kind of countervailing factors. And in fact, when beginning with a quote, Nigel Farage, who was the head of UKIP, a party which was advocating Britain leaving the UK, he formed the Brexit Party afterwards, and was seen in the gilded elevator with Donald Trump right after his election in 2016, an advocate of Britain's departure from the EU, said in an op-ed for the Daily Telegraph in March 2020, "We're all nationalists now." And he said this with a rejoicing, saying the pandemic makes us nationalists. Europeans are closing the borders. This is what he's been advocating for a long time. So he saw himself vindicated in his position. And you can also see this, graph or kind of photo montage, which was published in the Financial Times, which also talks about, isn't the nation state coming back? It's not the international organizations, it's really the states which are tackling the pandemic. Now, let me first take a bit of a background. What is nationalism like in Europe? And of course, one of the hardest things is identifying how important nationalism is, partly because if you ask people, are you a nationalist? Some people might say, yes, they are, but in fact, lots of people don't. So, lots of proxies to look at. You can look at, for example, how much people are exclusionary, how much they are hostile towards people of different cultures, of different backgrounds. There's a so-called ethnic distance test, which asks whether people are happy to have a friend, a relative, a boss, the president, be from a different ethnicity or religious group or otherwise. Many ways of looking at that. Just to give you an illustration here, a very simple one is I looked at the European Parliament, and the MEPs in the European Parliament were from far-right or nationalist political parties. Now, of course, categorization is always tricky because how do you classify certain parties? But I've looked at basically parties which are members of the faction which identify as nationalist right-wing parties. These would include parties like the Alternative for Germany from Germany, AfD, or the Rassemblement National, the National Assembly in France, led by Marine Le Pen, or the FPÖ in Austria, the Freedom Party in Austria, or the Lega, the League Party in Italy. So, and they include some parties which are in government, some in opposition. But just if you look at that graph, it's just to give you a sense, because you can look back for 20 years, So if you go back to the 1990s, roughly 5% of the MEPs in the European Parliament were from far right-wing and nationalist parties. Now that share goes up continuously, and last year at the elections, it ends up being around a quarter of the members of the entire Parliament, or 14 or 15% if you look at the members from the EU states, which were not in which were in the European Union already back in 1994. So that's kind of the comparable figure. Both of them tell you a story that nationalist parties are much stronger in Europe than they were 20 years ago. It's not a unidirectional development. It's not unstoppable, but it's indicative. It tells you that nationalism, the questions of migration, the questions of all of the kind of debates, which also the United States has been having, are on the agenda in Europe. Again, in some countries, these would be governing parties, part of coalitions. In others, they would be in opposition. So I think what we can say is that nationalism and far-right politics has been on the rise in Europe. And it's not even reflected just in this party landscape, because very often we find the main phenomena is being mainstream parties adopting it. Because of course in Europe we have a different party system than in the US. So we have a system where we have usually a larger number of parties than just two. It's more that you have, of course, parties on the far right, on the nationalist kind of spectrum, but you also have their ideas which might be adopted by mainstream parties to gain elections. So these numbers are in a certain way the most optimistic assessment of how prevalent nationalism is on the European agenda. So this is really very much the context against which the pandemic struck Europe. And of course, it struck it very hard in March of this year and very unevenly, with countries like Spain, Italy, France, and Belgium being much harder hit than some Scandinavian countries, Germany or Austria, for example. And there are many reasons that we don't know quite the full picture of what explains this kind of these differences. Some of it is just kind of timing. But of course, what it meant immediately is a closure of borders. So Europe's borders were closed rapidly and harshly. And of course, considering that open borders is one of the hallmarks of European integration, this was felt very painfully, and especially as in places like, as Barbara mentioned, Luxembourg, where I grew up in, is a country which is where, every direction you travel, within 50 miles, you have Belgium, Germany, or France. And over half of the working population are commuters from different countries. So they're crossing the border every day, and closing that border means that basically, half of your workforce cannot come to their jobs. And that's a particularly pronounced problem in Luxembourg, but it's a problem in countries like Switzerland and all across border areas in Europe. People are used to crossing the border every day to go to work. And in most of Europe, in the European Union, at least within the Schengen zone, it's not that different than crossing state lines in the United States. So it's really, there's a sign between Luxembourg and Germany, that border where it used to be border checkpoint. There's a fast food pizza delivery place in there now, and a kebab place. So this is what the border looks like. So these borders becoming hard borders where you cannot cross is quite a shock to people who in the last generation are not used to that anymore. And then also there was the question of, do we help each other? How can we help each other? And especially Italy, which was the hardest hit, felt in the first weeks like they were left alone. They were not given the assistance. And this sentiment was epitomized by a statement of Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, who, as on the picture on the right, you can see, he received assistance, medical assistance from China, stated the European solidarity is a fairy tale. So suggesting China is real, it's giving us real medical equipment. European solidarity is just a pipe dream, basically. Now, he said it for a whole set of political reasons. We can discuss it later on, but he captured the sentiment of many at the time that Europe was really not delivering on that. And so this, you could argue, was really a way in which nationalism was reinforced. And this is very much also what Nigel Farage was referring to, the idea that, finally Europe is closing its borders and every state is fending for itself. So that is in a certain way the first kind of strong sentiment. But what is striking there is that, and this is then reflected also in the way in which Europeans look at the European Union. So this is a survey on the top left. how people trust the European Union. And there, basically, you can see how Italians are those who specifically feel like their trust in the European Union has worsened. So 44% of Italians following the pandemic feel like their trust in the EU has dropped. And in fact, Italy, which is one of the most pro-European countries over the decades, has for the first time a significant share of Eurosceptics. So that's that picture. It's reflected in the sense that many Europeans feel like they didn't get help from other fellow Europeans. So of course, once the first kind of shock of the pandemic prevailed, there was a lot of solidarity. So, especially in border areas, we have severe cases of COVID victims and from hospitals when there was reaching capacity, were flown out of the country in France, for example, to Germany, to Luxembourg, to Switzerland. So there was that, but this was, of course, after the initial shock. So people in a certain way got the impression set by that first experience. And that's reflected in those numbers. So Italy is particularly strong, but across Europe, more people feel like their trust in the EU has worsened rather than improved. So that's one side of the story. But if we look at the right, this is again Eurobarometer, so this is European-wide surveys commissioned by the European Union, is that there you ask, should the EU have more competences to deal with crises such as the corona pandemic? And what you see there is actually quite interesting. An overwhelming number of Europeans believe, yes, the EU should have more competences. So there you see the average in the European Union is 66% of European citizens totally agree with this statement. Now, this is interesting because usually people who are Eurosceptic are against more competences of the EU. This is the classic pattern of Euroscepticism, is people opposing more competences. The whole argument of the Brexit and Britain leaving the EU was always, taking back control. So this was the main slogan. So this was assuming that there's too many competences in what is called Brussels and not enough at the national level. Now, what we're seeing here is that people don't trust the EU or are dissatisfied with the EU, not because it has too many competences, but rather because it has too little, too few. So, this is exactly what has been the problem. The EU has basically no role in public health. So when the pandemic struck, the EU couldn't do anything because, it doesn't have the federal institutions like the US has. There is no Center for Disease Control or any institution at the European level comparable. So what we're seeing here is people are skeptical about the EU, but not because it does too much, but rather because it does too little. So maybe that skepticism is not quite as, kind of pessimistic or breaking the back of the EU as one might think at first. Now, let me look at the second part, which is the kind of xenophobic dimension. And of course, this is a global phenomena, and there's evidence from the United States that Asian Americans have been targeted through acts of discrimination. And of course, we have a famous statement by US President Trump, who talked about the China virus, or associated the virus with China, and that had a kind of distinct xenophobic overtone. In case of Europe as well, we have kind of three phenomena, I would say. First is open discrimination against minorities. There's a record that Asians in Europe have been targeted because they are seen as being associated with the virus. So that there kind of reports, sometimes systematic, sometimes anecdotal, across Europe, which suggests that Asians in Europe have become victim of discrimination and xenophobia. Now, we also have that against other minorities, because, for example, Roma, also as they're known sometimes and colloquially and often derogatory as gypsies, are a trans-European minority, and they're often seen hostile and as being kind of dirty and backward, and those stereotypes play into, of course, stereotypes and xenophobia in these moments of pandemic. And also in cases like Hungary, for example, where we have a kind of nationalist government under Viktor Orban, he initially blamed migrants for the spread of disease, argued that migrants brought it into the country, which is empirically not true. There's no way they could have, because there are so few migrants, and they usually they usually arrived well before the disease did, but he blamed them. So migrants become a target, even if they're not from Asia, from China. The second element is that we have a record that this is, of course, also played out in the US, that some minority groups are disproportionately more affected by the disease itself. So this is not about discrimination, but it's about the fact that, in fact, COVID-19 is not indiscriminate, but it is discriminate. It's a disease which strikes some people more, and not just the elderly, but especially some minority groups. So we have on the right a statistic from Britain, which looks at the mortality rate per 100,000 in different ethnic groups in Britain. And there you can see quite clearly that a disproportionate number of non-whites are affected in terms of mortality rates. So Black British are significantly more, as well as other ethnic groups, are significantly worse affected by the pandemic. This is data from May, so this is, of course, one has to look at it down the road, but there are indications that certain ethnic groups are suffering more. Now, what explains that is a complicated matter, which has medical, epidemiological, and also socioeconomic causes, which I can't get into. But so there is in a certain way, the idea that we're all on the same boat is not true. Some people are, in fact, in a more vulnerable position. And then the final aspect is that minorities are often disproportionately affected by the policies of governments to fight the pandemic. So border closures affect minorities, often diasporas, people who often in Europe, there are millions of people who are labor migrants who are, in the European Union migrating to work. Romanians working in Spain and Italy, Bulgarians working in Germany, Croats working in Austria, people who are moving across borders as part of their regular work, and all of a sudden they're stuck. So there was even big discussions across many European countries of how to get some of this labor migration into the country during the pandemic, because they were essential workers for agriculture. So there was a big, in Germany, asparagus is a big vegetable to have at asparagus season. So there was it's a classical, situation. These vegetables are harvested by migrants. This is not a job done by Germans, just like, these jobs are usually done by less well-paid migrants. So there was a lot of effort to bring these workers into the country to ensure that the Germans could have their asparagus when they're used to. But overall, there are certain migrant groups which are particularly affected by the disease, or for example, a Roma who often live in substandard health conditions, in kind of what you could call slums and really bad housing, are often have less preventive measures to take care. Or we have the whole phenomena of, if you're in a lockdown, you can't go to school. Groups who don't speak the native language of the majority are disadvantaged because their children can't catch up with language learning quite as easily and with schoolwork. So, there are lots of trickle-down effects of the government policies, which often affect minorities disproportionately. And then there's the kind of question about, what about authoritarianism and the pandemic? And, I think just to kind of take a step back, nationalism and authoritarianism often work closely together. And of course, you can be an autocrat and not be a nationalist, and you can be a nationalist and not an autocrat. But especially in the kind of recent years, we find often a kind of symbiosis between the kind of authoritarianism and populism. Why? Because authoritarianism could be defined as a worldview where it's divided between us and them, a world between right and wrong. And usually the populist claims to represent the will of the people, and anybody else is illegitimate, right? Because usually it's a he, there are some women, but they are the exception, claim to represent the people. And who are the people? It's often defined in exclusionary nationalist terms. It doesn't need to be, but that's a common pattern. And so in that sense, we find a kind of close linkage between authoritarianism and nationalism, and exclusionary nationalism. And so how does it link to the pandemic? Well, first of all, of course, across the world, half of the world basically took measures of some kind of state of emergency during at least the first wave. With lockdowns, which meant, no freedom of assembly, certain freedoms were curtailed, which we take for granted in liberal democracies. They are included. I mean, currently, for example, in Austria, we have a curfew. I cannot leave the house after 8 p.m. There are 5 reasons for which I can leave, but I cannot go to a friend's house after 8 p.m. or come back from a friend's house after 8 p.m. without being fined. Now, that's a severe restriction of my civil liberties. Now, I can say this is fair, this is fine, but of course, we have to be aware that those are restrictions which occurred across the world. And some of these measures were deemed to be disproportionate. So in Hungary, for example, there was a suspension of parliament basically in the first lockdown, and also all kinds of rules and decisions taken during that period, which really centralized power in the government. In other cases, one felt that some of these measures were trying to prevent, for example, protests from taking place, because of course, a lot harder to protest if there are certain measures, in place which prevent freedom of assembly. Of course, we've seen protests, from Black Lives Matter in the United States to protests in Israel, to many protests in Europe. But again, they are much more difficult. There are many more challenges in these environments. And sometimes governments use the pandemic restrictions to also curtail the freedom of expression. So that sense, there's an obvious sense that authoritarianism and authoritarian measures curtail liberties at that moment, and that the pandemic provided at least an excuse. And that, for example, parliaments were often not in session in many European countries for weeks. Again, there's always the question of proportionality in all of those decisions. Now, I want to look now at what does it mean for the big European populist nationalist parties, what has happened since March. Because again, I think there are 2 contradictory trends, because there's the kind of authoritarian reflex, which strengthens populist nationalist leaders in power. But there's the other one, which is the populist skepticism towards science, the anti-elitist, the anti-expert dimension of populism, which we've seen everywhere. The idea that experts are redundant, that the will of, again, populism thrives on the idea of the will of the people, and that should not be curtailed or restrained by either checks and balances, by restraint in terms of human rights, but also not by expertise, because if the people want something, then this is what matters more than the experts say this is a bad idea. And so there's a kind of anti-scientist dimension to a lot of the kind of populist leadership around the world. So in that sense, this is the kind of contradiction which we have, that the populist authoritarian instincts on the one side see COVID as an opportunity to curtail civil liberties, and the other side are going to be challenging the conventional wisdom on how to fight the disease. Now, so if we look at European parties, I look at surveys, I look at a couple of countries, key countries in Europe surveys. This is Politico Europe has called a poll of polls, which brings together a number of polls across Europe from the main political parties. So you get a good sense of how European party landscapes developed. So I look at Germany, Italy, France, and Hungary. So we have a couple of countries like Germany and France, where we have strong nationalist populist opposition parties. In Germany, it's the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which has been relatively strong in the last elections and is, still a new party, not even a decade old, and has become drifted to the far right in recent years. And there, what we can see is that the party. So here, if you look at March of this year, the blue line is the AfD, the far right party. It didn't collapse, but it certainly declined. And we see a sharp rise of the conservative ruling party, CDU-CSU, which went up from around 25%, 26% to 35%. So this is basically what happened. What happened is that the ruling party, which is the coalition of the Social Democrats, SPD, and the CDU, increased in popularity, mostly reflected in the dominant party of Angela Merkel. So because it's seen as handling the crisis well, while on the other side, the far right, AfD, didn't benefit, in fact, declined during this period. And this is what we would expect. They cannot talk about migration because nobody cares about migration in these moments. And they are and I'll talk about that as next point, the question of of kind of conspiracy theories. They often are closely associated with the kind of conspiracy aspect of fighting COVID, but that is one which is vocal but quite marginal, and as a result, their vote share declined. So their kind of core constituency of anti-immigrant politics is not really enthusiasm a lot of people, and a good handling of an incumbent government has really undermined their popularity. Now we see a different trend in France. This is about whether or not who French voters would vote for in presidential elections in 2022. And there we can see Macron marked in yellow and Le Pen, the main far-right nationalist challenger. And they were basically neck on neck before the crisis began, just between 25 and 30% of the vote. And then Macron gained a slight advantage, a lot to do with the fighting of the pandemic. So he gained that advantage really in the period between March and the summer. And this is because he was seen as being decisive and strong in handling the pandemic. But that gap basically melted away by just a few days ago. And they are basically in the same terrain, partly because, again, of course, we have a second lockdown in France, and there's a sense of, what we have everywhere in Europe, that however well governments handled the crisis at first, we're kind of still in the position where throughout winter we're going to be not in a good place. So, but you can see there again, the populist right did not decline significantly due to the pandemic. So what you're seeing with all of this is a rather complicated picture. This is what I want to kind of make a point about, is that it's not clear. It's not like you can neither say that COVID destroyed the far right, nor that it strengthened it conclusively. It had an effect, but it's a contradictory effect. Here's another key European country, Italy. There we have the Lega, which is the far-right nationalist party, which was in government until last year. It was kicked out of government, but there what we can see is, quite interestingly, you might be at first glance looking at the party's decline, and indeed in numbers that's the case, but most of their support has gone to the FDI, the Fratelli d'Italia, which is the Brothers of Italy, which is another far-right group. So their joint share of the vote has been very stable at 40%. So again, what we're seeing here is that it's rather a recalibration within the far-right nationalist bloc rather than a sharp decline. And then the last country I'm looking at here is Hungary. Hungary has the government of a far-right Fidesz party led by Viktor Orban, who's been in power for a decade now and has been always in Europe presenting himself as the main defender of Europe. That's his argument. Very anti-immigrant, the first to build a fence and to stop migration, in a very rigid manner. And he's talking about this, every day. He has stayed steady since March at around 50% of popular support. And that's also because he had taken very hard measures to fight the pandemic. So this was, a very, very strong lockdown and so on. So, all of this tells you a picture basically of saying that the far right in Europe did not collapse as a result of COVID. We're not talking about a situation where people stop voting for the far right. Their motivations might have shifted. In some countries, like in Austria or Germany, the far right did decline significantly, but it has a lot of other reasons as well, or other contributing factors. So the pandemic itself is not enough to really shift the political debate and party landscape decisively. The last point I want to talk to before I'm concluding is, of course, the issue of conspiracies in Europe. Namely, and of course globally, that while some scholars believe that the pandemic would give rise to a new refound belief in expertise because we need doctors to fight the pandemic, we also see the rise of conspiracy theories. And on the left, you can see a survey conducted in May in Britain, which talks about the main kind of conspiracy theories, such as for example, you kind of get some anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The Jews have created the virus to collapse the economy, or the coronavirus is a Chinese bioweapon, or Bill Gates is responsible for the virus. And there you can see that pretty much you get a share of between, you know, some of the, let's say, some of the more, let's say, plausible or not quite as outlandish claims, such as the Chinese biological weapons argument. Nearly a third or over a third of all citizens believe that theory, while the fact that Jews or Muslims are blamed for this still gets a significant share. So roughly over 20% or around 20% of citizens believe those conspiracy theories, and numbers are comparable elsewhere as well. So there is a certain I think what we're noticing is that, you know, that there is attraction for conspiracy theories, partly out of uncertainty, partly out of fear, and that often, as those questions also suggest, are not just driven by the pandemic, but they're feed into and are often drawing from tropes and themes which are there. Anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and other groups become targets. So they're not in a certain way detached from nationalism, but they're reinforcing it. So there's a caricature on the right here, a German one, which is saying, it's a wordplay on "Wir sind das Volk," which is "we are the people," a slogan of the revolution in East Germany in 1989, to "Wirr ist das Volk," which means is confused, or rather, sort of confused is the people, and it is about how at the demonstrations against the pandemic or against the government measures, we find a broad array of people from kind of leftist anti-vaxxers to far-right Reichsbürger, as they're known in Germany, people who don't recognize the existence of the German state and claim it's a private corporation, and rather claim that there's some imaginary German Reich still in existence, which doesn't exist anymore. But so you get a kind of very eclectic mix. But what this means is that you get people who are, you know, skeptics about the pandemic, going together with extreme far-right ideas. And so in that sense, we get the kind of this mixture of very odd trends. So the picture is, I'm not going to give you a simple answer to the question. I think COVID has certain effects on reinforcing nationalism in Europe, has certain elements where it strengthens some of the trends we've seen, whether it is xenophobia, whether it is the conspiracy theories reinforcing existing kind of themes of conspiracies. There are, of course, these countervailing trends, which I've talked about, the fact that there's some sense of solidarity, which does emerge now. There's a stronger sense of EU integration as being important for citizens. And of course, here is just the recent Eurobarometer, again, number on what do people care about the most. And, you know, a year ago, migration was the biggest issue in Europe. 23% of people believed that this was what mattered most. And now you can see it collapsed by 13% and is now, in fact, it was above 30% and it collapsed to around 23%. So it basically became from the most important issue in Europe to the second or third most important issue, eclipsed by questions of economic situation and the public finances. So this just tells you that migration is, of course, less important, but that's not the end of the story. And of course, at the end of the pandemic, migration might again become an issue, and other topics very quickly interfere. So in Austria, of course, now where we've had the worst terrorist attack in decades, a few days ago in Vienna, of course, terrorism and of course the fear of radical Islam associated with it becomes very important on the agenda. So again, we should not believe that the pandemic is the end of history or the end of nationalism in Europe, but rather just a way in which it transforms existing trends. And of course, we're in the middle of it, so we can't predict exactly how it will play out, but it's something which certainly will remain our concern. Just to kind of conclude, Barbara already mentioned I've written a book about nationalism, which is more historical and an overview, which might be of interest. And then there's also an article, some of the arguments which I've presented here. I've developed a bit more detail there. It's available free, online, open access with nationalities papers called Global Nationalism, the Times of COVID-19. I wrote it in April, so it's no longer the freshest, but it was a first response on trying to reflect on nationalism globally as a response to the pandemic. So yeah, so that's it, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, so thank you so much for this very informative and interesting talk. I think we learned a lot about the situation in Europe, differences to, we heard about some differences about what is going on in Europe as opposed to the US. We also heard about some similarities, I think, this question or even fact that COVID is not the great equalizer, but targets some minority groups disproportionately. The big question, which I would say as a European here in the US is even more salient than in Europe. How do you negotiate individual freedom versus the collective good or necessary public health measures? And then what I think is also a really interesting aspect that you mentioned, and I wasn't aware of this before. Basically, you said the political parties and the institutionalized far right political parties. So far, COVID has not changed a lot, but the tropes and the themes of the far right, they have become increasingly a part of the conspiracy theories that happen outside the formal political sphere, but nonetheless, I think, or at least I have the impression, maybe that's also going to be a question, that are growing, especially on social media, and that are kind of getting more traction. But I'm sure there are many questions and many comments. Let me suggest that if you please feel free to ask a question, raise a hand if possible. If you want to ask a question, and my colleague Olivia Brown is going to monitor the chat at the same time, and so you can also put questions for Professor Bieber in the chat. So please, any comments, any questions about this?
While people are thinking, there's a couple questions from a few minutes ago in the chat. The first one was an interest in the 5-star movement in Italy and whether that's contributed to a rise on the far right there. And then the second question is whether COVID has led to a decrease in party system institutionalization in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I saw the questions. I mean, the 5-star movement in Italy is a strange creature. I mean, it's not exactly a far right group, and it has, it's a populist party, but it has a kind of more centrist agenda. I mean, they were in coalition with the Lega party until last year, and then they broke up and instead joined a coalition with the center-left Social Democrats, or the Democratic Party as it's known in Italy. But I would say that they're more populist than far right, and their share of the vote is rather dropped, not because of the pandemic, but because of their, in a certain way, seen as abandoning their kind of anti-establishment origins and cooperating with the kind of classic establishment party. Their share of the vote is around 15% at the moment in Italy, so it's not that they've been really benefiting from the crisis. I mean, if anything, they've gained something maybe because they're seen as handling COVID, despite the horrific numbers in Italy, very seriously. So they were seen as being fairly kind of professional, more professional than maybe the anti-establishment background might have indicated. On the question about party system institutionalization, I mean that's a really interesting one. I would be, I mean, again, we're talking about speculation and it's hard to say, but I would be generally believe that it's not likely. I mean, I don't see that I think one larger question, which I didn't talk about here, but is, of course, to which degree, what is the impact of the pandemic of citizens' trust in state, right? And how much do citizens continue to trust that the state can protect them? So on one side, we have this trend where, people look at the state and expect something from the state in a way which was not the case for a long time, right? So because they realize that it's not private businesses which can save them. I mean, they can develop the vaccine, but whether it's restrictions on freedoms in terms of making sure that the disease doesn't spread or providing for healthcare, people in Europe look at the state to help, manage the crisis. So a strong state is more effective. And we see also in countries like Austria, which has a good public healthcare system, that citizens are very happy with that. You see people saying, well, in the past, we're saying, well, why do we invest so much in public health? Now people say, well, this was good that we did, because now we are in a place where not at the first crisis do we get at maximum capacity of, for example, emergency care and intensive care. So there's that element of actually looking at the state, but then there's also skepticism because people get very different and misleading messages from the state. We've seen this very rigid lockdown in the spring. We've seen the loosening of throughout this in the summer, and then another lockdown now. So people are kind of confused and also impatient. And I think this, undermines trust in the state in different states, irrespective of which party is in power. And that, of course, is likely to express itself in some distrust in politics. And I think it's too early to say whether that means that people are going to be either less politically engaged or more likely to support kind of anti-establishment parties or go into non-institutional kind of channels. So, we've seen across Europe these protests against pandemic measures in Germany, large ones in Austria as well. There are also even kind of little riots or so on against some restrictions, lockdowns in Italy and Spain. The numbers are usually much slower than they would just the images give, and they're often a very eclectic bunch, which probably couldn't agree on much else besides the kind of the argument of we don't want to be restricted, but they have everything from people who the anti-vaxxers to the far right, so they're not exactly likely to join a political party together. They might all express a certain degree of dissatisfaction, but I don't think they're necessarily going to be a logical political force. And in fact, parties which associate with them also lose a lot of credibility in Europe because their risk is being kind of on the side of the people with the tinfoil hats, and that's not exactly that alienates some part of the electorate from them. So that, I think you see this in Austria, the Freedom Party, which was a coalition governing party until last year when it was kicked out because of a major corruption scandal. Far-right party has become a spokesperson of the kind of anti-corona measures, opening the economy, not wearing masks, and so on. But that is, that has not helped to stop their decline, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that many parts of the electorate do see the reasonable need to have measures and see their policies as being rather strange and in effect turning out counterproductive.
Olivia, I think there is more in the chat.
Yes, Dr. Pieper, do you see the questions in the chat, or would you prefer?
Yes, I do see them. Okay. I can just pick up on them if you want to, Olivia. So yeah, there's a question by Xenia whether or not I think Vučić would be toppled in Serbia. That's a very specific question, of course, in my area of expertise. And I think this is an interesting case. We had this one of the first elections which took place during the pandemic in June, where in fact the government stopped all restrictions before the elections, including soccer games with 20,000 participants took place. And it seemed like basically the pandemic was over, and immediately as the elections were held, lockdown was again proclaimed, and then people went to the streets. They didn't protest against the new lockdown, but felt that they were played with and kind of lied to for the sake of elections. So there's a great degree of dissatisfaction, but also a parliament which has been, due to the boycott of opposition, in the hands overwhelmingly by the ruling party. The ruling coalition has over 240 of the 250 seats in parliament there at the moment. So there's no opposition in parliament. And I don't think Vučić, who I quoted in my presentation, will be toppled anytime soon, not because he's so popular, but because the opposition is very weak and divided and has a hard time in finding a common voice at the moment. But it's not written in stone, and it's not forever, but it's going to be a good while, I'm afraid to say. Hope I answered your question, Xenia. And then I see Patricia asked a question. Has the pressure from far-right group, populist group throughout Europe pushed for more separation from the European Union? Well, this is exactly, I think, one of the interesting things is that, the far-right groups in Europe nationalist groups have been always arguing we need less Europe. We need less European integration. We need less cooperation in Europe. And what citizens are actually saying is, we don't like Europe at the moment because it's not doing enough for us. It's not it doesn't have enough competences. So in a certain way, they're asking for something which there's very little, there are few political parties offering that, because most political mainstream parties say everything is fine at the moment, we don't want to touch it, the European Union, the treaties, and the nationalists say we want less of it. So many Europeans, in fact, are saying we want more Europe in a particular area, maybe in public health at the moment, but that's not really kind of found its way into politics. So in that sense, I think and I think that's why the far right has also not benefited from the crisis, because while people might be dissatisfied with Europe, they're also dissatisfied with their own national governments. So it's not that think their governments are doing great and Europe is doing badly. And it's also that they're asking something which Europe is not been offering, and that's not what far right parties do. They don't say we want more Europe. They say we want less Europe. So in that sense, I think there's a certain demand where there hasn't been a supply in terms of European party politics at the moment. And then we have Samuel, who is asking about what are your thoughts on nationalism and regionalism in Spain, considering that many of the advocates are left-leaning or left-leaning opposed to right-wing nationalists? Yeah, so that's a good point. It's a general question. I mean, of course, I've conflated far-right and nationalist in Europe, and that's, of course, a shortcut, because that's not exclusively true. In Spain, it's true the Catalan independence movement has also a strong left-wing dimension to it. Or in Ireland, Sinn Féin is also a nationalist party for unification of Ireland, but it's also quite Marxist, or at least it used to be Marxist in its ideology. It's certainly a left-wing political party. Or if you go to Kosovo, Vete Vendosi, the largest political party there, is also nationalist, but it's also a left-wing party. So they exist. They're in a minority in Europe, but they are around there. And I would say that it's hard to say what the impact of the crisis and COVID has been on them. We see in places like Scotland, where for also there, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, is also a nationalist party in terms of favoring Scottish secession or disassociation from the UK, has become stronger. But again, that strength, I think a lot of it works on the basis, not on the issue of nationalism, but rather not if they're seen as being competent of handling the crisis. And that's, in the case of Scotland, the government is seen as more competent in handling the pandemic than the British government. So that case, local governments might benefit, whether they are self-identified nationalist, left-wing or right-wing. But it's then that they can of course sell their message combined with that if they're successful. So in a certain way, the effectiveness of the response to the pandemic and their communication matters more than their content in a certain way on that ideological spectrum. Then Finn asks a question about the impact of COVID on elections in Montenegro. So this is another of my hobby horses. Being really a smaller country, I mean bigger than Luxembourg, but not exactly a major power. That's a country where the incumbent power for 30 years lost elections. The ruling party lost elections in late August, and it's interesting whether or not this has anything to do with COVID or not. My sense is that probably not that much. Montenegro was one of the countries which, for example, when I talked about restrictions of freedoms, it publicly listed on a website the names of people who were supposed to self-isolate. So people who came into the country who were given the orders to not go into public, to quarantine themselves, were put on a website with the kind of request of saying, well, monitor those people and report to the police if they're out there, which of course from any, perspective of data protection and also freedoms is highly problematic. I don't think that's at the end decisive. I think much more, of course, again, I think this is what happens is the pandemic brings out distrust or skepticism of citizens towards governments. And especially in countries like Southeastern Europe, we've seen governments taking a lot more restrictive measures than maybe, let's say, Scandinavia on the other side of the spectrum. And I think some of it had to do with the fact that the health system is much worse. So the governments knew that they couldn't afford this kind of Swedish model, which is kind of a higher level of laissez-faire because they have greater healthcare capacity. So that's one part of the story. But the other one is also that citizens don't trust the government, governments don't trust the citizens. So they felt they had to be more repressive because they can't trust on citizens kind of good behavior, which countries like Sweden could count on. And this is something which, of course, is reflective of the larger sense of distrust between citizens and governments in the region, and that I think then expresses itself in moments of elections as well. And I think this is, in that sense, it contributed, but I don't think it was decisive. Then we have a question by Syriacus on, if I hope I pronounced this right, in the long term, will the outbreak of the global pandemic affect European integration process of the Western Balkans? Yeah, I think that's a good question. Thanks. Well, I mean, in one way you can say that, many other processes, including EU integration of the Balkans, is dropped off the agenda because the EU is dealing with this pandemic. So in a certain way, it overshadows everything else. So, there were, for example, the first half of this year, you don't have summits in the conventional way. You really are held back also when it comes to financial resources, where the EU needs a lot of money to invest in recovery, in economic recovery. There are some signals, and the EU has been trying to, in a certain way, send the message that they're not entirely forgetting other processes, including the EU integration of the Balkans. But one of the big problems, which I've noted, is that the curtailments of civil liberties took a particularly harsh line in the Balkans, and it means that in a certain way the countries are more authoritarian now than they were before the pandemic, and that of course makes it harder to join the European Union, because the EU might not be critical enough of authoritarian drift within itself. It's not going to let in more autocrats into the Union. I think there are quite a few skeptics in Europe about that. And so the path for the countries like Serbia to the European Union is much harder now with the more authoritarian leadership in place. So I think that is going to be a problem down the road. And Alfredo asked, do you expect that these trends with Euroscepticism, the rise and disillusionment of the European collaboration will continue after the COVID pandemic? Well, I mean, in one sense, I do think that because previous Euroscepticism, the remedy was less Europe, less European integration. Now this Euroscepticism actually leaves space for more European integration, and in that sense, you could argue that this is the first, in a certain way, productive Euroscepticism, which could actually lead to more cooperation in Europe. And in fact, if you look at the numbers. The kind of years before the pandemic, there was a sense of actually increasing number of Europeans identifying as Europeans and trusting in European institutions. That number was at a record high since the measurement began before the pandemic. So in fact, Europeans have become more, that's a paradox, is on one side, you have a strong nationalist parties in Europe. On the other side, you have a record number of people who say that they're Europeans. And I think that's an kind of interesting trend, and it's hard to kind of make sense of it, but I think often you find these contradictory trends happening at the same time. So that's, I think the overall trend in Europe is that there is a strong sense of strengthening European identification. And depending on how the EU handles the crisis down the road, and it's not over, it could actually lead to more European integration. Because again, also we know that these crises are often, what political scientists sometimes call critical junctures. These moments when things can be done, institutional designs can be changed in a way which you couldn't do in normal circumstance. I mean, President Obama's introduction of healthcare in the United States was only possible because of, whatever you think about it, was only possible because of the economic crisis before. Without it, it couldn't have happened. And it's this kind of junctures where major crisis allows for significant shifts in public policy. And I think the pandemic is one of those moments where there could be major shifts. So there is the opportunity, whether or not it will be seized is a different question, of strengthening European integration. But again, I mean, this is not something which is on the agenda right now, but it's certainly a possibility based on the circumstance.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Let me maybe ask a last one, something that I really find intriguing. So you mentioned the conspiracy theories and this kind of bit of eclectic groups of anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, esoteric people, especially in Europe. This is kind of the groups that we see in the streets. But so my impression is that these conspiracy theories and conspiracy movements, also like QAnon, are really becoming more successful and more widespread. And I'm wondering, I mean, maybe this is the $1 million question that's really hard to answer, but what are the reasons behind it? Does it have to do with aspects that you mentioned, like a general disenchantment of politics that we see in many of the Western democracies, even before COVID? Or is it actually related to the rise of the far right, which already, brings kind of these arguments to the public sphere, and then conspiracy movements like QAnon can build on those? So did you have any view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the rise of these conspiracy theories in the public sphere it would be too short-sighted to claim, I think, as you rightly point out, is that it just began with the pandemic, and that it's just something which, and of course, a lot of these theories and trends and groups have their origins predating the pandemic. I mean, and they just got a greater audience. And I think what we see is, again, that there's a significant share of the electorate, in the US and in Europe, which believe in quite outlandish conspiracy theories. And, of course, it's hard to say to which degree they were maybe always there, and to which degree they just couldn't organize and couldn't communicate before, of course, social media. So, that's what we find, a lot of them come out of like the whole social media sphere from all, from the kind of margins to the mainstream. And that these are people who might have been sitting around in their homes and reading or believing this stuff 2 decades ago, but they didn't have a chance to kind of get together and didn't have the courage to go to a public square and protest because they thought they would be laughed at or ridiculed. And now they realize that they have a critical mass, at least enough to kind of have a certain degree of solidarity amongst themselves. So I think that's really the hard thing is it just that they're more vocal and more visible, or are they actually more numerous? And I think we'll never quite know that. It's certainly, what is also interesting is that they're definitely that they're quite international. I mean, this is of course ironic that these conspiracy theories, they're not national. But the themes, the canon kind of, this is a very American conspiracy theory. That has resonance in Europe is even more surprising because it's so much embedded in American, in American cultural themes, cultural references, that in Europe it seems kind of very strange. But it takes off. Or even the Reichsbürger, who have mentioned the idea of these in Germany. Also some in Austria who believe that Germany is a corporation, not a state, and that people shouldn't recognize the state and they print their own passport. I mean, that goes a lot, that's a lot of the themes of which you find with American militias and people who reject the state authority. And that's something which in Germany was unheard of a decade ago. So there's a lot of kind of transatlantic cooperation of conspiracy theories and far right groups. And that's something which is quite interesting because I don't think we had that before. That in a certain way, also they kind of blame Bill Gates, or in another way, the anti-Soros theme, which we have in the far right in the United States, as well as in Hungary, as well as in other places where George Soros is seen as kind of the villain, which of course feeds back on kind of anti-Semitic tropes and on all of those themes. So that's interesting. I find that there's this kind of transnational cooperation and exchange of ideas, and they travel despite the fact that they are, that the cultural context is very different and the kind of political landscape is different. And so I think that's something which maybe has become more pronounced also because now with the pandemic, there's a global challenge. So in a certain way, how some Americans are protesting against the COVID measures resonates with Germans who have the same, rejection of it, or Austrians or Italians, because it's the same challenge. I mean, you could say the same as with migration, but there's some kind of these questions which are global, allow also for global nationalist responses. And I find it quite interesting, in fact, that many of these movements are also in Europe no longer framing themselves as being national, but as being European. I mean, they often call themselves, I mentioned Viktor Orban, who who talked about being a defender of Europe. So he does present himself as a defender of Hungary, but he also says he's defending Europe. So there's this also in Germany. We had a few years ago Pegida, which was a protest movement in East Germany against Islam, but it was calling itself patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident. So it evoked Europe, it evoked the Occident, it didn't evoke Germany specifically for all kinds of reasons, but you can see all of these movements often frame themselves and position themselves as much wider than just national. And of course, the same is with terrorists, from Auckland to Norway, they often also use those European or white frames rather than the conventional national frames. And that, I think, is something which is quite interesting and, again, dangerous, of course, but also hard to predict how that will develop in the coming years.
That's really interesting what you're saying, this ambivalence of, nationalist and a nationalist agenda, but that then becomes transnational or is transformed into a transnational movement, and all this diffusion of ideas that's taking place by actors who originally said, we are here to defend, I don't know, the sovereignty of the UK or Germany or Austria. Anyway, we could talk for much longer. I see that there were many questions here, but we have to stop here also because we want to have Professor Bieber enjoy his evening now, and because you guys, I know that many of you guys have to go to the next class. I would like to thank you, Florian, very, very much for coming today and for speaking to us. We really, really enjoyed this talk. I apologize again for the glitch at the beginning, but I hope this wasn't the last time that we saw each other. Maybe also, after COVID in person. That would be awesome if we could welcome you here in Austin. So thank you very much again for this talk. I would like to thank everybody who was here today, that you came to this talk organized by the Department of Germanic Studies. Everybody be safe and be well, and talk to you soon. And again, Florian Bieber, thank you so much for this. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. Thanks to all the great questions. Good luck to all of you, and stay healthy and stay safe.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Stay in touch, of course.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.